in advance, or some of the conversation that people have about rent in advance. Now, we look to, obviously, legislation to get a definition of what is rent in advance, and it's when a tenant actually pays rent on or before the due date. This payment is then allocated for a specific period of time in accordance with the requirements that are set out in their residential tenancy agreement, so their lease. Okay, so we're talking residential leases or tenancy agreements at this point in time. Now, in accordance with the Residential Tenancies Act of 2010, a landlord or agent cannot ask a tenant to pay more than 2 weeks' rent in advance and cannot ask for the tenant's next rental payment until all of that rent has been used up. Okay, now, let me give you an example. If the tenancy agreement begins on, let's say, the 1st of November, since it's the 1st of November today, the tenant pays 4 weeks' rent for bond and then 2 weeks' rent in advance. Okay, so the 2 weeks' rent in advance covers that period from today, the 1st of November, until the 14th of November. The tenant does not need to pay a further 2 weeks' rent in advance to cover until the 15th of November, and that will cover the period from the 15th of November to the 28th of November, so a further 14 days. So if a tenant requests to pay more than 2 weeks' rent in advance, they'll need to request that in writing, and obviously you as an agent will need to keep a copy of that for your on the tenant's file. Now, questions we've had is about tenants who have overpaid in rent. Now, that's not rent in advance because we've just defined what rent in advance is, and that's rent in advance to cover a specific period. And that's just, normal rent payments. So now if a tenant has overpaid their rent, whether by mistake or on purpose, we need to refer to Schedule 1 of the Property and Stock Agents Regulations of 2022 for how agents in New South Wales deal with such a situation. Okay, now Clause 19 of Schedule 1 specifically states that an agent must pay rental money for each calendar month, less authorised expenses obviously, owing to a landlord under a residential tenancy agreement at the end of each calendar month, unless instructed otherwise by the landlord. Very important words, those last ones, unless instructed otherwise by the landlord. So let's look at what that really means in a little bit more detail. This clause requires you to disperse all monies received as rental payments across to the landlord at least monthly. However, we go back to the scenario if the tenant has overpaid rent and the landlord instructs you to retain those funds until they are due, then you're able to do so because you've got those instructions in writing, and that's that unless instructed otherwise by the landlord phrase of that clause 19. Okay, so it's instructed by the landlord, so that's a good thing. Now, always remember that a landlord or their agent cannot require a tenant to pay more than 2 weeks' rent in advance, as we said before. That's really important to remember that. So if your landlord doesn't want the tenant to overpay their rent, then you'd need to instruct the tenant of that, okay, that they're only required to pay the rent due by the due date and no more. So this would be a very specific type of landlord that is making that request. And as an agent, you should also check, if a tenant is stating that they're making an overpayment, then perhaps talk to them about what it is that the landlord is actually requesting here. And obviously go back to your residential tenancy agreement and talk to them about that. So there can be a whole range of different scenarios, and that's where obviously discussions start with your landlord, with your tenant, to make sure that everybody is happy there. But remember, it all needs to be dispersed unless instructed otherwise by the landlord as per Clause 19 of Schedule 1 of the regulation.